we have with us General Andrzejczak, Chief of Defense Staff of the Polish Forces. Please join me welcoming him to the stage. General, this is a good place for you right there. Absolutely. Please have a seat. Please have a seat.
Eastern flank.
Absolutely. Far eastern flank. We have with us Mike Carpenter from the United States, Senior Director at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy, an old friend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense.
Western flank.
This is okay. We like Mike on the eastern flank too.
Just kidding.
We have Jamie. There is Jamie. Jamie really needs no introduction in this crowd. But Jamie is NATO, and NATO is Jamie. And now you are, after 38 years in the alliance, you are now out, so you can say everything that you wanted always to say without any limitations.
I'm only here and one day only.
Okay, excellent. And my colleague Alina Inayeh, Director of the Bucharest office of the German Marshall Fund, who is bringing also the Black Sea perspective to our panel. Yes, please. I want to jump in very quickly to the discussion, but I think it's good for us to just frame it for one moment. And I'm so glad that our discussion really flows very naturally from yesterday's and this morning's discussion. I want to look in our panel at what happened since 2014 through the Wales Summit, the Warsaw Summit, the Brussels Summit, all the way now in the run-up to the London meetings of leaders. We have seen improvements. They are good news. Many of the speakers mentioned this. We are seeing NATO adaptation with the enhanced forward presence. We see increased spending both on the part of the United States through the European Deterrence Initiative, as well as NATO's European continental allies. We see greater Polish-American cooperation that recently resulted in the declaration of security cooperation with the increased forces in Poland. Professor Paruch talked about the fourth Trump idea. It's not exactly one fourth, as many of you know, but this is pretty much what Poland was aiming at. But on the other side, we see a great negative changes when it comes to security environment from 2014, but onwards. Not only is the further militarization and military adaptation of the Russian Federation, but it's also the rise of China, of which we talked a lot about. The potential Russia-China cooperation, if not synchronization, the US-China competition, instability, and then I would say deficit of trust in the transatlantic relations. So we live in an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable world, and here we live on the edge of the alliance. So we feel it particularly strongly. The alliance is adjusting, but the question is it fast enough? So I think Kasia also started with this question of what keeps you up at night, which clearly we all not sleeping very well if you are asking this question. And I do want to start with this question to General Andrzejczak. You are looking at all the possible scenarios, all the possible dangers facing Poland, very much from someone who will have to do something about it. So what keeps you up at night, both in the conventional and less conventional dimension? Over to you.
I'm hot.
Is it working?
I'm hot? All right. I'm armor, so too much technology for me. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning. It's a big pleasure and honor for me to be here and to share my observations. To be a chief of defense is not so much time for sleeping, so it's very difficult to say what wake me up in the middle of the night, but the two things definitely. The first, two small boys, my grandsons, doing noise everywhere, so definitely. One is 3, a second one is 1. So they a lot of concerns in my mind, not because I'm getting used to be a grandfather, but also looking in the future, I'm just asking myself what the future would be for them. And from a very, very military perspective, I'm a soldier, so I not see so many uniforms here, So please let me explain a little bit in a very military flavor. What I would like to say is readiness, readiness, and readiness. That should be everything. If you are ready, you can face any kind of a challenge. It's a first step for deterrence, and is a measurement of your capability for defense. So definitely readiness in all domains, starting from a very tactical, technical aspects, going up to the doctrine, strategical documents, up to the mental readiness, what we observe, especially because we have a lot of new terms, 5G, we have a cyber domain, a lot of the complicated issues. So, but before we go, let me say a few words about timing perspective, where we are today in October in Warsaw 2019. So from a very military perspective, I will go shortly 1991, when the Desert in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and we observed the last conventional use of military power in a very Cold War fashion and organization. That was the last purely armored attack, and everybody felt really comfortable. We were sure that we're safe. The big superpower across Atlantic projected force and to solve all of the problems. So there was a huge impact in our perception of security. And then, 1999, Poland joined NATO, and a few years later, 2001, everything changed. 9/11, and we completely lost Russia from the radar. There was no Russia anymore, and we lost China. There was not China yet on the radar in 2001. So we started the global war on terror. All of the implications in our perception building, capability, strategy, and so on. So immediately we going and to see Georgia was still old-fashioned, heavy, not well trained, not well equipped, with a weak leadership Russian army invading Georgia. So it was not enough to change our perception, but there was some of the yellow lights in our minds. But very soon in 2014, we were completely surprised, and there was we were not sure that we were still secure. And in the same time, in a very nervous discussions, a little bit energized by Poland, in Wallace, in Newport, we established all of the elements of our reaction. We were a little bit too reactive, but all of the elements, the EFP, the NRF, enhanced NRF, VJTF, NFUs, multinational court are getting a little bit higher level of readiness again. So the NATO started to discuss whether we are ready or not. And then a very, very short period of time, we observed completely different using instruments of power in Syria. Very deliberated, using the special forces, the long artillery attacks, using aviations in big distances, and very effective strategical communications called the Russian propaganda. So definitely there was a point, but we set up in the Warsaw the new structure, EFP, and also a multinational division, the Northeast. I would like to really emphasize that in a very short period of time the division was built and certificated and is ready to fight tonight in this part of the theater. So that's the perception in the line of time. And then a little bit physical aspects like geography. Poland is in the crossroad of everything in this part of the world. So all historical linkage from Moscow through the Smolensk Gate, through the Vyazma, and then along the Pripyat River is going to the heart of Poland, which is Warsaw, this place where we are sitting right now. And then any kind of movement, projection, is going to the Berlin and now facing across Atlantic. So this linkage, historical, physical linkage for movement, trade, money, information, knowledge, and also instruments of power is absolutely natural. We can we will like it or not, but it doesn't really matter. It's just the way it is. So the Poland, having in mind the historical context, the timeline and dynamics, and also geographical aspects, has no choice. And I will put additional line from the north down to the south area, which is a linkage between St. Petersburg, Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, going to Poland and down to across the Carpathian line to the Black Sea. This additional crossroad and the kind of a junction, strategical junction. So what we observe is the back to some historical aspects again, the slightly different domain, but the one thing which is completely different is a compression of time factor. Everything is absolutely fast and overlapping all of the things we're just considering. So still the same physical area, natural, with all of the historical context, but the speed of decision, speed of thinking, speed of adaptation, speed of reaction is absolutely crucial. And also I would like to emphasize the Polish approach to the security, to be sure and to assure and to reassure, which is pretty nice game of words. That we put security incredibly high. And the first is our national responsibility to defend Poland itself. So the 2% of GDP, which was a great discussion in the last NATO summit in Brussels. 3 divisions. The 4th is being built. 5th is multinational, ready to go. About the implementation of a new capabilities, air defense system, long artillery elements, the 5th generation airplanes, which are on the way to being in the army. This is our national responsibility that we have to take. And then the next one is alliance. We are not able to defend ourselves without the relations. So from this perspective, and I mentioned the timeline and also geographical, we immediately moved our attention to the east, to the Russia. And because no so many officers here, that I would like just to disagree a little bit with the term eastern flank. To be honest, for us, it's not the flank. We're facing Russia. Russia is in the front. So this line is not the flank. It's not the left or right. So this is a kind of a change in our vocabulary and military dictionary. So great cooperation with Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. We have bilateral relations as well, because if you're going really in the eastern direction, not necessarily in the eastern flank, so you have no choice and no time. So going your perspective to the western direction, they still are a little bit different. And we have to understand it. Alliance is about discussions, about agreement, and about taking about all kind of a perspective and a national interest as well. And that leads to the cooperation with the biggest alliance, which is the United States of America, the biggest superpower still, and the main player in the NATO. So what we observe here, our discussion about the new installations, infrastructure, special forces, ISR systems, also the logistics, very important to be able to project the military instruments of power if needed. So it is nothing against the NATO. It's an example of our determination. We would like to be regional leader and to define the speed of adaptation and to motivate everybody else, that because we're living here in Warsaw, we're living in Poland, in this part of Europe, which is the front line of anything happens. So that's my couple of observations, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. So you talked about the changing nature of conflict, and I would like to talk about it a little bit more also, how when we look through the 90s, 2000s, then with Donbass, Crimea, and then most recently Syria, where we are going next, because we should be preparing for the next war rather than the past wars. And I would like to come back also to the question how ready we are, in fact, and how we are doing also when it comes to military mobility. But you end your presentation, your intervention on the questions of the alliance. So I want to turn to you, Jamie, and if you can look specifically to what's going on, not on the eastern flank. I guess we have to figure out better terminology for this. I mean, with the Warsaw and then Brussels summits, we built a tripwire plus strategy. So the question, and I think General is pointing out to it, how are we doing on the implementation of this? Are these tripwires connected to something that is sufficient to deter our neighbor from the east?
Thanks for those 64 million zloty questions before lunch, Michael. First of all, on sleep. General Joffre, you remember the French commander in 1914, he was famous for sleeping long hours and not allowing any of his aides ever, under any circumstances, to wake him up. But he still won the Battle of the Marne, so sleep and good strategy are perfectly compatible. First observation. Second observation, if you are going to have a successful defense, you need to be able to fight today, in other words, to deal with an initial incursion or provocation, but you've also got to be able to fight tomorrow. You've got to be able to sustain it if that initial defense doesn't work. I think I would give NATO sort of 8 out of 10 good marks on the fight today aspect of this. The last 5 years, and all of you in the room are familiar with the main developments, have seen NATO quickly getting back in the collective defense game. The battalions are there. The United States is upping its presence. Recently, 1,000 extra soldiers coming to Poland. Maybe not be Fort Trump, but certainly an increased US presence, perhaps another 1,000. And just a couple of days ago, the US announcing that it's deploying also a battalion in Lithuania for a short period. I also think Trident Juncture was a good exercise in the ability of the Americans to quickly reinforce Europe. The Harry Truman aircraft carrier was redeployed to Norway within a matter of days. US forces were deployed quickly from the United States. Just a couple of days ago, we also learned Ulm, the Germans have set up the initial operating capability of this enabling command as well. And so, in a way, NATO has responded. The battalions may not be very armour heavy, but the fact that over 20 allies are somehow involved does sort of demonstrate solidarity. And the Russians know very well, therefore, that an attack on one country would be obviously, not just in legal Article 5 terms, but in de facto, an attack on all allies. But of course, the key thing is fight tomorrow. And here, yes, I do have concerns, and I think the London summit has got to factor on some of these. The first thing is the disparity in armour. The Russians have got 760 tanks, according to RAND figures, on the other side of the border. NATO, only 130. 90 of those, of course, are part of the US rotational presence. Russia has got 1,720 infantry fighting vehicles. On the NATO side, only 280, and again, 132 of those are United States. The only permanent US presence in Europe today, not persistent but permanent, is the Striker brigade in Italy with 300 wheeled Striker vehicles. So I think the first thing that NATO has to do is look at this disparity in armour and how we address it. One way is, of course, to beef up the battalions into brigades, as some have suggested, with a higher armoured presence. Another aspect is to pre-store more US and other countries' heavy armour forward. For example, the US recently, with some NATO infrastructure funding, is setting up a warehouse not so far from here to store that kind of equipment. Another thing that NATO has to look at, which I think is a big gap, is deep fires, is more artillery firepower, and particularly second echelon interdiction, which we were at during the Cold War, where you need the missile capability, conventional missile capability, to interdict command posts, troop deployments, concentrations at distances over 1,000 kilometers to interdict second echelon. The INF Treaty, whatever you think about it, and I was an advocate of keeping the INF Treaty, but the demise of the INF Treaty is certainly going to put Russia down this road. They're doing it already with the SSC-8 deployments and the Iskander deployments, and I think NATO has to look at this as well. And of course, the General mentioned already air defense. So first of all, the ability to be heavy quickly and not wait for lengthy reinforcements to come in, I think is key. Because the heavier the presence we have here, the longer the resistance can be continued, and the more time we then have to work on our reinforcement strategy. So are we heavily enough deployed forward? Second is exercises. I've admired NATO's ability, I was part of it myself in a minor way, to use exercises for political signaling, political demonstration. It's great to see Trident Juncture and to see so many allies deploy, to show solidarity. It sends a political message. But I think now in the second stage, we've got to be more demanding about exercises. Yes, they're demonstrating solidarity. Yes, they're waving the flag. But are they also really helping us to be interoperable? Are they helping us to fight? What lessons are we learning here in whether or not we would win? We need more red team, blue team exercises to answer those kind of questions. Third thing, mobility. We are now, whether we like it or not, in a reinforcement strategy, which of course puts questions on intelligence and early warning, early political decision making. The General is completely right when he talks of speed. We had a NATO exercise very recently, not the most recent one, but 2 years ago, where political hesitation over deploying the very high readiness task force to a Baltic state meant that whereas it would have been 100% effective on Monday, by the time the political authorities agreed to deploy on Friday, Sacco had to report that the situation had changed and that force would be no good at all. So assets are not absolute, they are dependent on the when and where you deploy them. And we have to look at this asset speed nexus, I think, more thoroughly. But the key thing, of course, is that we're depending on a lot of critical infrastructure. If all of US tanks are coming into Europe through one German port, which is then subject to a devastating Russia cyber attack, if we're dealing with nodal points or choke points in the hands of the private sector, which don't have adequate security or resilience, if we have roads and bridges that can't take heavy armor, if the German Bundesbahn does not have rail capacity and tank transport capacity, we are going to be stymied. Now, during the Cold War, much of this so-called civil preparedness was in the hands of governments who could flick a switch and immediately convey it to military use. It's now in the hands of the private sector. 75% host nation support, private sector. 90% mobility, private sector. And I think our ability to work with the private sector to bring this critical infrastructure up to standard, to work with the EU in the new financial framework, where the EU is devoting 6.5 billion euros to upgrading European transnational networks, and to ensure that those networks are hardened also for military use, I think is going to be absolutely key. We don't want private sector infrastructure to become the new Achilles heel of NATO. Next point, very briefly, there are two A2AD screens that I see. One we're focusing on, Kaliningrad, the Slovakia Gap, in this area. The other one is in the North Atlantic, where we are seriously weak in anti-submarine warfare capability, where Russia is investing very, very heavily indeed. We're setting up a new command in Norfolk, a JFC, a US Admiral is already there, but looking at that ability to control the Atlantic, particularly against persistent Russian submarine activity, I think is going to be something that we have to look at, and that means we have to bring the maritime dimension and maritime capability much more into this party. Finally, as we go forward, we are going to, and we're already there, be dealing with two types of warfare. There is classic conventional warfare, which unfortunately is reality. But ironically, the more successful we are at blocking that conventional type of aggression, the more our adversaries, and they're doing it already, are going to sort of try to go under us, go over us, and go around us with the hybrid tactics that we see already. And they may believe that hybrid tactics can bring the results of warfare, that they don't need to resort to classical warfare any longer because disinformation, influence campaigns, cyber attacks, provocations can win. And therefore, I think the great challenge of the London summit, and this is my final remark, at least in the opening round, is to build 2 NATOs. We need to build 2 NATOs, and we're not there yet. We need to rebuild the NATO of collective defence and the ability to deter, but also to fight and prevail if we're ever called upon to do so, and have some assurance that we have the equipment, the presence, the tactics to be able to do that. But given that we're going to be faced on a day-to-day basis, we need to build a second, totally different but related NATO, which would be a NATO much more into intelligence, early warning, cyber, new technologies, working with the private sector, working with the EU, hardening the critical infrastructure, keeping the functionality of our societies going so that we can't be undermined by the rear in this way. And that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde sort of kind of NATO is the way to go in the future. And therefore, we cannot do one at the expense of the other. And I think the London summit has to take some pretty hard decisions in transforming NATO in both areas and making sure that both work in tandem. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Jamie, you put so much on the table, including the big questions of our ability to mobilize and move quickly enough, not only within Europe, but also across the Atlantic. And on the cyber informational warfare space, many would argue that we are in this conflict already. And so we have to be building this plane as we are flying it. Both of you actually mentioned A2AD and the arc that stretches from St. Petersburg. Some people would even put it higher in the Arctic, through the Baltic Sea, but it ends in the Black Sea. So I want to turn to Alina to bring your perspective from the Black Sea. This is one piece that by many has been described as an unfinished business from the Brussels summit and others. We see another A2AD bubble actually out of Crimea. So tell us a little bit more about the situation there, and also how do you see Romania and other countries in the region dealing with it?
We are talking about the eastern flank, or you can use the B9 format if that's a better way to address it and avoid the flank word. As a unitary or homogeneous flank. Yet it's not that homogeneous. If you look at the northern part of the flank, at the southern part of the flank, which I'm going to talk about, the Black Sea, there are some discrepancies. And the unfinished business is more unfinished in the Black Sea, I would argue, than that up in the northern part of the flank. In the Black Sea region, in the countries around the Black Sea, within the countries around the Black Sea, there is less cooperation than you can see in the northern flank. You have Romania, Bulgaria, I might even add Turkey into this, and we have to talk about Turkey if we are to talk about the Black Sea. And then you have, of course, as a partner, Ukraine, and they are very homogeneous, not only in the way they address security, but in the way they perceive threats, in the way they perceive the level of the threat coming from Russia. And here I do refer mainly about Bulgaria and Turkey. Then you also have the Crimea military buildup. You have all of the Russian weapons and munition being built up in Crimea, and you do have an open conflict in eastern Ukraine, which supposedly is going to be solved soon, if we are to listen to President Zelensky. Yet it's influencing the entire dynamic in the Black Sea. And then, as I said, last but not least, you have Turkey, which has been a very loyal ally, but which is sending different signals through the deal on S-400 with Russia, through the possible sanctions that the reaction to the possible sanctions that the US might impose on Turkey. So you do have Turkey, which is there, has been supportive most of the times, but we still don't know what is going to happen and what decision they are going to take should anything happen in the Black Sea, and I'm talking about the sea itself. And then you have a very weak and yet unaddressed maritime security. Yes, you do have a lot of exercises, and the number of exercises has increased lately, yet there is no permanent process, or there is no permanent structure, or there is no permanent cooperation to actually address the maritime security of the Black Sea. There have been initiatives, but again, because of the different level of the threat perception, they didn't get that far. And most importantly, because we've been talking about mobility, and mobility is very important, around the Black Sea, you have a very poor infrastructure, which is much poorer than it is in the northern part of the eastern flank, and this has not been addressed yet. So if anything happens down there, it will be very difficult for troops, for tanks to come to the rescue. And because you mentioned that there might be a future conflict which should keep us awake at night, we are, as you later said, we are in the middle of the conflict, at least in the countries in the Black Sea. But not only, Russia is doing a lot on the hybrid dimension of its war, informational warfare, mingling into internal affairs, political affairs, economic affairs of the countries. And because of the structure of the societies, both in Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, I believe we are a little more vulnerable to the Russian disinformation and to the Russian interferences than in the northern flank. Not to forget to mention here the role of the Orthodox Church, which is very, very active there. But I do want to mention a little bit about the positive developments in the Black Sea. So it's not only bad developments or vulnerabilities. NATO is paying indeed more attention to the Black Sea, and Black Sea has been mentioned, and there have been some measures taken towards the Black Sea since the Warsaw Summit, actually, at every summit since then, and every ministerial since then. So this is a good development. Then, of course, not to forget, there is the Deveselu anti-missile shield, elements of the anti-missile shield, and the Michał Kogalniceanu base, which is actually being expanded and modernized. And then, but this is something that hasn't been tackled too well on, there are wonderful partners in the Black Sea. Georgia is a great partner, Ukraine is a great partner, but again, they have not been used enough when it comes to the maritime vulnerabilities and to the maritime security of the sea itself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alina. I want to turn to Mike, because a lot of everything that we talked about depends on the US ability to both show up and project deterrence. So, I mean, number of questions to you, Mike. One is just in pure military terms, how you served in the Pentagon under President Obama. There since has been new US defense strategy, new US security strategy. So on one hand, I would love for you to give us your outlook of how US is getting ready for everything that is happening both in Europe, in the Pacific, and the Middle East. But also just, you have been focusing the Pentagon on Russia, Ukraine, Georgia. Tell us how you are seeing this as an expert. We have, recently been together actually in Tbilisi where there are some very worrying developments. So I would like to talk about these countries, and one country we haven't mentioned yet is Belarus, maybe more specifically. And then the third one, all in 4 minutes or so, and I will put you on the spot on this one a little bit, but how worried should we about the dysfunctionality of Washington right now? To what extent the political fights impact US over longer term as an ally for all its allies throughout the world? So if you can talk for a moment about the political fights at home and its impact, or maybe not having an impact on US ability to be an ally. We can leave this toward the end.
Okay, thank you, Michał. Well, I'll start by saying I think there's a large degree of continuity between defense strategy at the tail end of the Obama administration and what we're seeing from the new national security strategy that the Trump administration has put in place. It's an emphasis on great power competition, sustained conflict, long-term conflict and competition with Russia and China, also with other state actors like Iran, North Korea. Of course, the threat of global terrorism, although it's no longer in the forefront, exists, and I would predict to this audience that Syria will be back in the news within the next 12, 18 months as a successor organization to ISIS reemerges under either the same name or a different name, and we'll be contending with that as well. So, but I think large elements of continuity, the development of the platforms that are necessary to be able to compete in the 21st century, we need to emphasize especially speed, mobility, but the third offset strategy that was put in place by Ash Carter, who is my boss at the Pentagon, remains largely in place today. It's developing that qualitative military edge that has sustained US superiority for decades now against all adversaries. Where I think the discussion, and we can come back maybe to Ukraine and Georgia at a later point, but where I think the discussion today is missing a crucial element is we're talking a lot about capabilities, and I completely agree with everything that's been said. Poland needs to look at air defense, artillery fires, ISR. These are the sorts of things. Fifth generation aircraft, of course, will help with the A2AD challenge. These are very important investments, and we can talk about what specifically might be needed in the Baltic states to ensure that the deterrence level there is as strong as it is here, because I think there is a disparity between the Baltics and Poland. But the big elephant in the room that we have not discussed at all is really the credibility of Article 5. And look, Article 5, collective defense, is fundamentally based on the marriage of two things. It's political will and its military capabilities. And so we've talked about the military capabilities, and we've talked about how those need to advance, and that's a good discussion. It's an important discussion, and the details matter. They matter tremendously. But political will is equally important. You can have the best NATO military in the world. If the alliance is not prepared to use it, it will be useless. And my biggest concerns as we approach the London summit is that we have at least two allies, and I'm going to be very blunt here, I'm going to name them, Turkey and Hungary, that don't share the values in many respects with the rest of the alliance. Turkey has already been mentioned by my colleague here on the panel, buying Russian S-400 systems designed specifically with the intention of shooting down an F-16 aircraft. That's what the sort of the purpose, not the sole purpose, but the intended purpose of the S-400. And entering into a de facto alliance with Putin's Russia, even as Turkey remains a NATO ally. You just have to ask yourself, how many other members of NATO would be willing to defend Turkey in a crisis? And would Turkey be willing to defend some of its NATO allies in a crisis? Those are questions that I think we need to take a good, hard look at. And, and to a lesser degree, we have some questions about Hungary. Do we feel confident sharing intelligence with Hungary, given its close relationship with Putin's Russia? It's an open question. But we shouldn't sweep it under the rug. These kind of considerations, we can't pretend that we're just going to talk about, F-35s and Patriot missile batteries and whether we need an additional company in the Baltic states, because then we're missing the big picture here, right? And if we don't have solidarity, which is fundamentally based on values at the end of the day, that's where I take a little bit of issue with the previous speaker, who proposes a sort of a realist view of international relations. Realism is fine, realism is good, but it treats nation states as black boxes that behave homogeneously, right? But the matter of the regime, the nature of the regime matters. The nature of the regime in Turkey matters to alliance cohesion. And so as we look forward, I think this is going to be NATO's biggest challenge, because this is exactly the threat, the vulnerability that Russia is targeting. Putin is cultivating Mr. Orban, he is cultivating Mr. Erdogan, he is cultivating other leaders within the alliance, maybe with a little bit less success, in order to be able to break that collective solidarity. And if we don't figure out how to get our alliance back on course politically, The rest of it really doesn't matter.
Thank you very much, Mike. I actually want to turn to you, Jamie, for a second to follow up on this political will. Because Mike put on, this is exactly right in terms of what we need. Do you see it in similar way coming out straight from the alliance recently? How worried are you about the political will of the alliance and thus reliability of Article 5? And then we'll open up also for discussion. And General or Alina, if you want to jump in at this point as well, we just are limited on time. But I want to put you a little bit on the spot, Jamie, for now that you can speak very, very freely.
Well, this is a good question, absolutely. You could take a historical view and say that, frankly, NATO has always had black sheep in the family who were not evicted, notwithstanding voices sometimes in the US Congress to have a kind of NATO exclusion clause. NATO never had that. And you could argue that over time, I don't need to name the black sheep. You can think who they were in the 60s and 70s. Those black sheep sort of came back. To the family. Patience won, and we still see with Turkey the local elections and so on, won by the opposition and so on. So I don't think we should sort of write off democracy in these countries. Persistence, keeping the family together, I think has paid off as a strategy, number one. I think the second thing is that in the hybrid area, it's going to be very important for NATO to develop a pattern or program of response. For example, after the attack on Salisbury, you remember the Novichok agent, you had all allies agreeing, and in the EU as well, to expel Russian diplomats, to take certain measures. And to my mind, I am quite satisfied. We may disagree on this, and of course I can't prove this scientifically, but I'm satisfied that if there were a big Russian tank attack tomorrow on a Baltic state, Article 5 would kick in. The outrage would be such that I think that allies would fulfil their commitments. Even like France never backed down from Article 5 during the period of General de Gaulle. What I think is the real challenge, of course, is these pinprick hybrid attacks, where you can say, oh, it's only Estonia that suffered the attack, it wasn't me, so I'm not going to risk my relationship with Russia on sanctions for somebody else. And it's much harder to take lots of little decisions all the time on sub-Article 5 issues. Do I really want to escalate on this? Is it worth it? What do I gain? Than to take a big Article 5 decision where it's a black and white, open and shut case. So my view is that the way that NATO has to start dealing with this is to start, and working with the EU as well, working itself into a playbook of what is going to be, critical infrastructure protection, how to deal with provocations and cyber attacks, how to deal with the fake news, the playbook of the responsive measures that we could take, that we know that we're comfortable with, that we're going to work, and being consistent, because how you deter hybrid is not by having a nuclear weapon. It's being consistent in your reaction, your approach over time. Improving our intelligence, because the better the intelligence, the harder it is for an ally to wiggle out of its responsibility by saying, I don't trust your intelligence. It doesn't sound like a duck or move like a duck or quack like a duck as far as I'm concerned. So the more we are successful in gradually building up a pattern of resistance to this type of hybrid activity, being consistent in our responses, showing solidarity, classifying it in the right way, the more I think we will rebuild that solidarity which can help with Article 5. But I'm not in any way undervaluing what was said there, because frankly there's a problem. Would we rather not have it? Of course we would rather not have it. But I'm not very convinced either by certain sort of think tank articles that say we should restructure NATO around purely the core of the true believers and eliminate the rest. I'm not so sure that that would serve us in the long run.
Thank you. I have two fingers from General, Alina, and Mike, and we have very little time, and Kasia will take us down in a second, and I do want to bring people from the audience, exactly. So if we can be very brief.
Thank you very much for this absolutely interesting observation, Article 5, which is a political decision. It's not a military. I'm army, I'm an officer, I'm a soldier. So, but the most important, from my perspective, when I'm going to the military committees or talking to the chief of defenses, is what kind of military advice we're preparing for the politicians to decide. So it's about our credibility. If we are ready, really, if you are fair and we say, that's what mission we can accomplish. That's we are not able. We need additional money. We need additional time, additional decision. We got to change the strategical documents. That would be fair. So from a military perspective, we are responsible for providing absolutely deliberated military advice. And then the next step will be political decision for Article 5. So the credibility, how we communicate about our deterrence, the exercise that was perfectly mentioned here, about our cohesion, at least in a military domain, is absolutely critical. So without this one, politicians will not have an appetite, will, or sometimes even right to decide. So the relations between the military advice, which is a purely military area, and confronting with a very, very complicated political decision to engage and to launch the Article 5 will be absolutely crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. Alina, 15 seconds and then.
15 seconds. Two issues. We keep talking about tanks and missiles, but as Jamie has pointed out, what's going on in the hybrid warfare, in the cyberspace, disruptions that Russia is having within the economies and the politics of certain countries, of all countries actually, within the alliance. I think these are equally important, and we feel them down there in the Black Sea. We feel them equally threatening to the tanks and the ships and the missiles that Russia is waving at us. And second, to answer your question about the US politics and how what's going on there is going to influence commitments to the alliance or commitments to the eastern flank, because that's what we are talking about. Let's not forget that despite all the whims in the US politics, despite all of the tweets and everything, there has been an increase in the number of troops sent to the eastern flanks, in the resources put on the eastern flank. Mikhail Kogonicianu base is going to be expanded with generous American contribution. So as I said, despite of all of the tweets, there are things happening in the eastern flank, and there are resources being put on the eastern flank by the U.S., not only administration, but Congress and State Department. And I think the 2% helps.
Absolutely. Same in Poland. Mike.
3 very quick points. So first, Jamie, the bipolar structure of the Cold War is no longer with us. So we're in a fundamentally different world now when it concerns political cohesion. Imagine that a military dictatorship in Greece or Turkey in the 60s or 70s was buying equipment from the Soviet Union and allying itself with the Kremlin then. Totally different scenario. Number 2, the implication of this. Look at what President Trump said about defending Montenegro and how he cast doubt on the ability to defend an ally because the country was allegedly aggressive, or whatever words he used. Deeply, deeply hurtful to the credibility of Article 5. And then to your point, your last point here, Alina, this is all the more important when we face hybrid threats. So whatever doubts Trump casts about defending Montenegro from an attack, imagine a conventional attack, what about a cyber attack? What about some sort of other unconventional attack in North Macedonia or some other small country that's a member of the alliance? Is the cohesion there? This amplifies the issue.
Thanks. We are eating into our coffee break, and then we'll turn off our mics, but I do want to bring everyone in the room because we have great people. Please limit your question or intervention to 30 seconds. I want to ask our colleagues from Romania for a first question. Then I see Julian. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Lieutenant General Șomordolea Mihai, Secretary of the Romanian Council for National Defense. And first of all, I cannot agree more on what General Andrzejczak said. Defense on the eastern flank, including Black Sea region, must remain top priorities to the security situation in the area. Being here in Warsaw, I want to highlight the reciprocal participation on the territories of 2 countries, Romania and Poland, with troops in the allied structure that have been deployed to implement NATO's decision, which proves the joint determination to actively get involved in enhancing security in the region. The process of US troops in Romania is a strategic ally is complementary to NATO forward presence, being
General,
the strongest signal
need
of
a
support
question.
and solidarity. Thank you very much for this intervention.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And if I could ask Julian to ask a pointed question to a specific person, you have always done this well.
I have a pointed question. Julian Lindy, French chairman of the Aachen Group. You're not talking about the military adaptation of the alliance. You're talking about the political transformation of the alliance.
Bring mic closer. Mic closer.
Yeah, you're not, with due respect, you're not talking about the military adaptation of the alliance. You're talking about the political transformation of the alliance to meet the threats that we face. Listening to your very erudite comments reminded me of conversations in the 1930s between the British and the French about the Maginot Line. Do you think, given the broad array of threats that we face, that there is sufficient political understanding across the alliance that we can transform our command structures to make our deterrence credible? Because with due respect again, listening to this conversation, I'm very worried that we're hiding behind a military metaphor when we need to communicate to our political leaders the gravity of the threat that we face.
Thank you very much. There in the back row, lady in the back row, if you could pass on the mic. Yeah, keep your hands up. Thanks.
Thank you. Tanya Lati from the European Parliament. Jamie, of course, music to my ears, the two NATOs, which by and large in practice already kind of exist, since we all know that NATO has, let's say, expanded its collective deterrence mission. But so what I want to emphasize again is that this has to happen with the EU and not without it. And to transatlanticists like you and myself, this of course makes perfect sense. And in Brussels, this also makes perfect sense, that we have to completely harness the complementarity of the two mandates of the EU and NATO. So my question is, how can we overcome purely defense industrial interests and move towards a transatlantic strategic thinking, and what can we put on the agenda of the London summit to kind of make sure to put forward this discussion? Thank you.
We have a number of other questions, but we have time for only one. So I'll go with the gentleman right here who was first among the three.
Thank you. My name is Steve Meyer. I come from Washington. I talked to a number of colleagues, Georgian and Ukrainian, and their cry to me is, if we only had been members of NATO. And my response is, you sure it would have worked out, or would it have been an enormous embarrassment for NATO? Assume an incursion, a hybrid incursion into the Baltics. What do we do? Do you really think that two heavily armed nuclear states are going to go to war over Estonia? And by the way, Article 5 does not oblige the alliance to go to war, to take military action. That's a possibility. And also, it's intended to be a holding action until it can be turned over by NATO to the United Nations. So how do we handle that incursion into the Baltics, especially if it continues to grow and grow and grow? You ready to go to war?
Thank you very much. So we literally have 1 minute each. Are we ready to go to war? Polish-Romanian cooperation, command structure, and also place of the EU. Alina, I will start with you. Come this way. Address any point, one point that you would like to do.
As I said, we have wonderful partners in the Black Sea region and Ukraine. I'm referring to Ukraine and Georgia. There is no prospect for immediate membership for them, and they have been told this repeatedly and openly by all of the NATO officials. And I think it's important to find ways, and I think we can find ways to keep them involved and involve them even more without trying to offer them membership, because that's impossible to be given in the short term. But there are other ways through which they can be involved, should be involved, and should be used in the Black Sea, but not only.
Thanks. Jamie.
Just my 5 seconds. First of all, on the hybrid scenarios, what concerns NATO, of course, is when these also acquire a surreptitious military dimension, amphibious landings, little green men, young Russians coming across the border in large numbers for tourism and the like. And my sense is that what we need to do is make sure that the battalions that are here on a permanent basis are deeply embedded with the local border guards, or with the Federal Emergency Services, with the intelligence services, and even with things like the Estonian Cyber Defence League, the citizens' army, the units of these part-time volunteers who have the skills from the private sector in cyber that sometimes the military lack. I think that's the future as well, in a joined-up structure of anticipation. Myself, I've been arguing at NATO, with the little sort of influence I have these days, that the command structure needs a SOF, a Special Operation Forces Command. At the moment, we have the Special Operation Forces as a memorandum of understanding sort of training cooperation unit, but we need a soft command under SACEUR, which can also use our soft forces, who are often the eyes and ears in the Arctic, in the High North, in the Baltics, again, working with the border guards to have an initial nip-it-in-the-bud response capability, or at least be able to determine quickly what's going on. I mean, the whole function of hybrid is to confuse, to be deceptive, to be difficult to attribute, to delay you while you're trying to figure out what's going on. And I think, the fact that the Special Operation Forces are now part of the NATO response force is the way to go. Article 5, you're right, is not an obligation, and a French defense minister in the 1950s, René Plevan, was asked by an American journalist, because Article 5 was not automatic, well, what was the answer? And he said, we need to deploy one American soldier in Germany. And the journalist said, Mr. Le Ministre, you're joking, just one American soldier? Yeah, he gets killed first. And so to some degree, the forward layering defense, which I mentioned, having the US far forward, having Canada far forward, this layer cake thing where the maximum number of allies are exposed to danger, is the best guarantee that Article 5 will actually work on the day. I have perhaps more confidence of people in the audience here. EU and all of that, I think now that the EU is starting to spend serious money on defense, in the new financial framework, the amount of money on defence research and capability development, PESCO, European Defence Fund, goes from 2.8 billion euros, ladies and gentlemen, to 22.5 billion euros. That's serious money. We have to try to do in the NATO area what we can to do to prevail upon our EU colleagues to devote that money to capabilities that also help fill the NATO collective defence order of battle, and are not simply designed only for sort of out-of-area operations in Africa and the Middle East. I'm not saying they're not necessary, but to tie that capability development money into also allowing the EU, through Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, also to take on some of this effort, particularly in a hybrid area, which the EU is very well capable of playing in the forward deployed. So NATO has to be the beneficiary of that cash, and not just the EU.
Mike.
So just very quickly, I think a political crisis requires a political solution. I don't know that changing the command structures is the necessary means by which to address this particular issue that we face. And then on hybrid, I agree. I'm really getting so sick of the references to little green men, because that was the scenario in Crimea, but even in Donbass, just a few months later, we were not looking at little green men. We were looking at little gray men, communities that were already resident there in the Donbass that were activated by the GRU. That's what we saw in Montenegro with the coup d'etat attempt in October of 2016. That's what we saw when Russia used an oligarch resident in Thessaloniki to pay off protesters to do violence in both Greece and North Macedonia to oppose the Prespa agreement. These are the scenarios of the future that we're going to face, and we're way behind in terms of strategy and tactics to adapt.
General Andrzejczak.
A lot of interesting topics, but I recognize the two very important words. There was Romania, Ukraine, and Georgia mentioned here, so, and as well as Estonia. So for our strategical parameter, it's absolutely crucial. Critically, the most important is how we understand our credibility using military instruments of power in the case of Article 5. So if we keep in mind that defending Poland in a time of crisis and war begins in Tallinn in Estonia, there will be enough. So we have to understand it works that way, and the same for any other NATO countries. If we're sending different and we're communicating strategically in a different way, we are weak. So that's narratives, that's considerations in mind, is absolutely start point for any kind of discussion. Nuclear aspects, absolutely important. We don't afraid really every single Russian soldier, and even the T-14 Armata tank platforms, what we see in the Red Square Moscow and every 9th of May. But what we are afraid is the strategical narratives for nuclear de-escalation. So it's a political will and authorization to use it. So that's the question for us, how we communicate those things. And I don't want to ignite any very tough discussions, but the NATO has a nuclear capability as well. So there's a question, philosophical question for us, how to consider, how to start discussions and how to communicate it in the other side, because the Russian respects only power. This is the only way to communicate. So not to go too far to ignite anything, but to be credible and to deter in strategical communication as well will be very critical. Thank you.
Well, the panel really outlined a monumental task, I would say, that is ahead of us when it comes to both political and military transformation that the alliance has to go through. And I think, Jamie, you put it pretty nicely when you said, well, we need not only one, but two NATOs. So that's I want to leave you with that, and please join me in thanking our excellent panel for the discussion.